over the past couple of years, then went to Germany, and then ultimately to a pair of flight schools in South Florida. Investigators now believe he was the one on board United Flight 93, the one that crashed ultimately in Pennsylvania. He was the one likely to have seized control from the flight crew. Paula?
Thanks so much, Miles. I wanted now to sort of reprise a bit of what Reverend Billy Graham had to say yesterday as he spoke at the National Prayer Service that was held at the National Cathedral to kind of get his perspective, the perspective of a man of the cloth. And he spoke, "Thank you, Mr. President, for calling this day of prayer and remembrance. We needed it at this time. We come together today to affirm our conviction that God cares for us, whatever our ethnic, religious, or political background may be. No matter how hard we try, words simply cannot express the horror, the shock, and the revulsion we all feel over what took place in this nation on Tuesday morning. September 11th will go down in our history as a day to remember." We know that the horror of all of this has affected you all in very deep and individual ways. That is also true of the correspondents who have covered this story. They have been touched in quite distinct ways. John King, Bill Hemmer, Elizabeth Cohen, all have stories to share with us this morning about perhaps what has struck them in the deepest way. Let's start off with John. John, I know you probably haven't gotten any sleep since Tuesday, but as you reflect on what this country has gone through over the last 4 days or so, what comes to mind?
Well, a personal observation first, then I want to talk about the week, the President Bush, the changes in the president we have seen over the week. When they evacuated the White House just after that plane hit the Pentagon, we were running across Pennsylvania Avenue and stopped to look up. One of our producers, Tim McCann, pointed up to the sky. There was a 747 directly above the White House. That is restricted airspace. You never see airplanes in the sky there. It turned out that that was a government plane, scrambled as all this was happening, one of the quote-unquote doomsday planes, an operational command center the military can fly in the case of war. But it came over the White House and it banked back. And we stood there in Lafayette Park looking at each other thinking, oh my God. And it flew off to the side, and only then, through our cellular phone conversations, did we find out what had happened at the Pentagon and what was happening throughout the Capitol. So obviously a very frightening environment. At one point we were standing in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, and Tim McCann yelled at me. He said, "Come back into the park." And I said, "I have to watch the building." And he said, "You know, you're not going to be able to file if you die." So that's why God created producers, I think, to tell us correspondents to use a little better judgment. So we went back to the other side of the park. But we will take some time to digest this. The country will and history will. But certainly we saw a very different president over the week. There was some controversy about why it took so long to get him back to Washington. When he did, of course, he delivered his first address to the American people from the Oval Office, telling them their government was up and running and that they were still investigating this. At that point, many thought the speech wasn't good enough. That is not the environment, whether you love or don't like this president, it's not the environment in which he is most comfortable. Over the next day, though, we saw the president use the words, "This is an act of war." Much more stern language about the investigation and retaliation. And the president has to juggle here. He has to be updated on the national security matters. He has to plan a potential military response. He also has to lead the nation. A very close parallel, I think, to what we saw, a defining moment of the Clinton presidency after the Oklahoma City bombing. So we saw President Bush in the National Cathedral yesterday, leading the nation in prayer. A very touching moment there, I think, when the president finished his remarks. He went back to sit down, and his father reached across Laura Bush and gave him a pat, an attaboy, if you will, from the 41st president to the 43rd president. And then the president, of course, went up to New York. This an atmosphere in which he is much more comfortable. Obviously, a very trying moment, seeing firsthand the depth of the deepest devastation up in New York, trying to give a pep talk, though, to those firefighters to keep them energized for the relief effort. A much more relaxed president here. You see him getting a fire hat here, a lot of glad handing and patting on the back, smiles. This, another role of the president, leading the nation in the recovery efforts, trying to keep the spirits high. Mr. Bush told reporters afterwards, though, he was quite struck here as he shook hands, that many of the people voiced anger and wanted immediate retaliation. One thing he said this week, I think, says it all about what we have seen. This is a president who came into office with a very detailed domestic agenda. Now he said in this past week, I want the American people, I want you all to understand this Fighting terrorism is now my mission. This has transformed my presidency. This was a week we were all going to be in Washington covering a very bitter partisan fight over the budget, over spending, over dipping into the Social Security surplus. All that is gone now. Bipartisanship is the word of the day in Washington. We'll see how long it lasts, but certainly with this crisis, deep bipartisanship and a president who says he now has a singular mission for the remaining years of his first term. Paula?
Sean, I'd like to come back to you a little bit later on for some more, even more personal reflections. I wanted to bring Bill into the discussion now. Bill, I know you just came to New York City yesterday, and I guess what I would like to share is, as a New Yorker, you know, of course, these images are shocking. They are mind-numbing. They are almost impossible to erase from your mind. But I guess what I have been most struck by is what you're seeing there this morning. These New Yorkers that continue to line up to volunteer. Reports of, you know, from all of the area hospitals that workers have had to turn volunteers away. Even though they need the blood, they can't accommodate the vast amounts of people that are showing up to donate, people giving out free food, people sending in clothing and supplies. It really is quite remarkable that you would see this level of support in the wake of this horrific tragedy. What are you seeing there this morning?
Watching it for 3.5, 4 days from Atlanta, we were told about the spirit of New York, and Paula, it's quite evident, even in this early morning hour, just about before 9 a.m. East Coast time. I'm virtually in a sea of humanity here. We've seen thousands and thousands of people who have come here to show up strictly to volunteer their time and their efforts to offer some sort of help in this ongoing effort here. A couple things struck me, though, flying in last night. First of all, we left Atlanta. And you know, Hartsfield International Airport, the busiest airport in the world, flying to New York City at night with a flight that took about an hour and 45 minutes. We did not see a single airplane in the sky the entire way up here until we got to the New York area, and even then there were just a few airplanes that we could spot in different areas. That's one thing that struck me. The other thing, we came in at somewhat of a low altitude in the New York City area. From 40 miles away, Paula, we could see the smoke still billowing up and away from the World Trade Center, and the floodlights were still brilliant in the night sky last night. And it was the tallest thing that we could see on the horizon, and quite evident and quite clear about the devastation here. The other thing, talking to New Yorkers, our colleagues here who have come back to the city to help out with CNN throughout the week here, the one thing they say that strikes them is to come into this town and see the line, the skyline here, without those two World Trade Centers at the center buildings at the bottom end of the island. They say for them that was the very heart of what that skyline meant to them, and at this point that heart has been ripped out. But again, we're seeing the gathering here of not only attitude, but also of work, of the people who have come here to help out. And the donations are overwhelming. We'll talk about that and a lot more coming up here shortly, Paula.
In fact, Bill, I mentioned a little bit early on, the Emergency Service Department of New York is actually telling people, we got enough already, you know, we appreciate your help, but, you know, don't overload our system. Bill, we're going to come back to you in a little bit as well.
Okay.
Elizabeth Cohen is probably in a part of the city that no one really wants to venture to. That is where the families are gathering, trying to get information on loved ones. Elizabeth, describe to us what you have seen.
What I've seen is an incredible amount of human strength, Paula. I am just amazed at these people who have lost spouses, brothers, sisters, children, who go from hospital to hospital. Some of them traipse the length of Manhattan, walk miles in a day to check out every hospital, and then to come down here to the Armory, which is the main place where people register their missing persons reports, and then also take a look at the lists of people who are in hospitals and lists of people who have been found deceased. I can't imagine how in that situation one would get out of bed, much less walk miles. They are truly amazing. They have been very energetic and persistent in getting the faces of their lost relatives on television. They really truly feel that if somehow if they're seen, that someone might have noticed them. One person said perhaps he got out of the crash and he's wandering around confused, wandering around Lower Manhattan, and maybe someone's seen him. Someone else said, I heard there are a lot of John Does in hospitals. They're in comas. Nobody knows who they are. They're too confused to say their identity. Maybe my brother is one of those John Does. So the strength that they have and the hope that they have is just incredible. I mean, even today I've run into people who still have hope. I think it's waning. I think perhaps the reality is setting in, but people still do have hope, and that just amazes me.
John, you're still with me, right?
Yes, indeed.
I guess, and I certainly don't mean to ask this question in a self-serving way, but we have all been trained as journalists to separate ourselves from sometimes the content of what we're covering. And I know I've been asked a lot over the last 48 hours or the last 76 hours, what is it like as a human level, as an American, to cover this? Isn't it all but impossible not to feel the pain and the horror of what so many thousands of Americans have experienced?
It's impossible not to feel the pain and the horror, especially as we run into colleagues who know people who worked at the Pentagon or know people in New York City. One of our producers had a college friend who's still missing up there in New York, and so it's hard not to feel the pain and the horror. At the same time, we have to be very careful in what we do. One of our challenges right now, the White House tells us that there's a continuing threat, so they're asking us to be very careful about what we say about where the president is at any given time, how he is traveling. So we need to be careful about that, and I believe we have a responsibility to do so. I think we can remain objective in our coverage of this, not only here in Washington, but up in New York, around the country, and indeed around the world. We can, I believe, remain objective in our coverage and be fair to all parties involved here, but still just show a little good judgment and a little common sense. We get access to the president and we get access to information because we have the privilege of covering the White House, and I consider it a great privilege regardless of who is the president of the United States. We get access because of that privilege, and I believe with that comes responsibility to show good judgment.
I absolutely agree with you, John, and I know the mayor of New York City implored us yesterday to exercise the kind of caution you are talking about. But if you would, and I'll share some of my thoughts with you on this, explain to the folks who are joining us this morning what it is like to be in the middle of a breaking news story where, in fact, you do have to sift through conflicting information. Haven't there been many occasions in the last several days where you simply have not gone with something that a source gave you because you couldn't confirm it?
Absolutely. We have a simple rule in journalism, and certainly here at CNN, on most matters that are sensitive and that we are getting stuff from sources, anonymous sources. If we can go on the air and say the president says or the Secretary of State says, it's a no-brainer. They said it, it's on the record. On a source matter, if it is sensitive, especially if it casts aspersions on somebody, we have a responsibility to double-check and in some cases to triple-check. So there are things I could say right now that have been told to me in this past week that I simply won't say because we don't know them to be true. And in a breaking situation, and I believe our people have tried to be as responsible as possible, there is often conflicting information. And so we have to say to our viewers, here is what we know right now, and please bear with us. In a situation like this, the information often changes. People report things that they believe to be true that turn out not to be true. We need to be careful, and that's sometimes hard because you're running around frantically. Often, in this case, we were reporting as we were being told to get away from the White House, and as the Secret Service, carrying automatic machine guns, was pushing us back across Lafayette Park. Now, they were doing that because of concerns for our safety. Paula?
All right, thanks, John. We'll catch up with you a little bit later on, as well as Bill Hemmer and Elizabeth Cohen. Right now, we wanted to give you an idea of how Americans have gotten their information since that brutal Tuesday morning. It appears as though many of you are getting your information from television. Jeannie Mose has that story.
If you're watching this story, you may already be hooked, horrified, yet mesmerized by planes aimed at buildings. Buildings that collapse before our very eyes over and over.
I can't really take my eyes off the TV.
And I also couldn't stand to watch TV one more minute.
Attack on America, attack on America, America under attack, whatever the networks call it.
It's addicting. I think it's addicting partly because we don't want to miss something.
Even if that something makes us sad.
I cry a lot when I hear the stories and see all the people.
If anybody see my daughter.
I think people feel guilty if they're not watching it. You know, that they feel in some way that they're betraying those that have really suffered.
You feel like you're participating because you're watching? That's an illusion.
What's not an illusion is the way the coverage tends to unite viewers in a shared experience, even if what's shared is sorrow. It's easy to OD on Crisis TV.
I don't want to watch it all the time, just because it kind of deadens the mind.
So how much is too much? We asked Dr. Jimmy Holland, head of the Department of Psychiatry at Sloan Kettering.
Everybody should ask themselves, is this making me feel better or feel worse? And if